Friends, dear followers, today is the day we're going to truly enjoy real chess. That's why I've brought my best board, my best camera, and my best microphone here, so this video will be a full experience for all of you. So if you're doing something else, I recommend you focus on this video, because if you love chess, you're really going to enjoy it. Take a look at the opening I'm going to show you today. The opening of the gods. The strangest opening in chess, and at first glance, the worst one. If I were to ask you, dear followers, what would be the worst move we could play in this position? Surely, one of the moves that would come to mind is this one right here, a 6. Well, watch out, because this is called the opening of the gods. And today we're going to see no more and no less how someone beats Anatoly Karpov. With this opening, careful, it took me a lot of effort to find this game, but I finally found it. Who is Anatoly Karpov, you ask? Are you seriously asking me that? World chess champion, and one of the greatest players in the history of the game. That's why if someone can beat him with this opening, they can beat anyone. And you can add it to your repertoire because almost no one knows how to counter it. Look, here the most common response is d4 to take control of the center. As you all know, controlling the center is vitally important in chess. Whoever controls the center has an advantage over their opponent. And that's why it seems like this opening isn't any good, because we're basically giving away the center to our opponent. But pay attention, because here the second move is b5, and it's a super important move. These are two moves that always go hand in hand in this opening. You don't need to think too much. You're always going to play a 6 and b5. That's why this opening will probably be easy for you to play and will give you good results. How would a typical ordinary game continue? Well, the usual move would be knight to f3, developing the pieces to be able to castle. It's normal for our opponent to continue naturally, and that's why we've played a 6 and b5, to develop our bishop through this fianchetto here, and to immediately keep an eye on this pawn. It's important not to develop the knights first in this opening, since we don't have pawns fighting for the center, and our opponent could quickly gain tempo by attacking them, and the same goes for the other knight. That's why we're going to play bishop to b7, directly aiming at the e4 square. Here, there are two ways to defend this pawn, with the knight, which seems very bad because they can chase the knight away, and once it's forced to move, we capture here, or the other, which seems much better, which is bishop to d3. While developing a kingside piece, it also defends this point that we're attacking with our bishop. Alright? Here, after the move knight to f6, Anatoly Karpov played queen to e2. This is the original game in which Anatoly Karpov won, and just for that, I deserve a good like. So, take a look. e6, a super important move if you want to play this opening. Why is this opening so easy and gives such good results? Because in all your games, you're always going to play these moves, and usually in this same order. A 6 and b5, you develop the bishop. And now you bring out the knight and push the pawn so you can develop your other bishop. Alright? Once you have all this set up, now the real game is about to begin. For example, what happens if they try to break up this pawn chain over here, which is actually what Anatoly Karpov played. So whenever they attack you here, you have to think about one thing. What happens if they capture us? Can we recapture? No, for two reasons. First, because here they can trade rooks, and then we lose this pawn. Or? Okay, that's the important part. So I recommend that whenever they play a4 against you, you can respond here with b4. A very important move. It doesn't let this knight here develop, and if at any point they want to play c3 or c4, this pawn can always capture. In this case, Anatoly Karpov's opponent played c5 directly and didn't care about being captured here because he planned to capture the central pawn. So Karpov first captured this pawn here, and after the capture, with this bishop, he didn't capture this pawn either because he wasn't too worried about it. Instead, he preferred to develop his knight. Could he have developed him over here? Yes, but we're facing the same problem as always. They can play b4 and attack this knight, which, as you can see right now, could only go backward because it doesn't have any squares forward. That's why he developed his knight to d2. Now this knight could come out here attacking this bishop. A very good move by Anatoly Karpov. Before they capture it, notice that he plays bishop 4. As I told you, before is always a very interesting move whenever they try to break through with a 4. Here, the black pieces took a little while to play it. I recommend playing it right away to avoid any kind of problem. Alright, here we come across one of the problems that I'm sure many of you are wondering about. What happens if by not fighting for the center they attack our knight with one of their pawns? For now, nothing happens, because we have this really good square to place our knight. If they want to drive it away, we can capture this pawn in passant and nothing at all would happen here. Therefore, this knight is very well placed. Look, if I ask you now, are the black pieces much worse off? Ugh! Most of you would probably answer no, and many of you might even say they're better off. That means this opening is not bad at all, and you'll drive all your opponents out of their comfort zones. Look, here the white pieces played knight to e4, a super interesting move because first, it centralizes the knight, second, it attacks the bishop, and third, it opens up this diagonal for the light squared bishop. That's why we can say this move is really good. Also, if this bishop retreats, this knight can jump here and give a really annoying check to the king. The black piece is retreating. The bishop to the y7 square to control this square here. It makes a lot of sense because of what I just mentioned to you. Otherwise, they would lose castling. Speaking of castling, white castles. Anatoly Karpov castles. Black develops this knight. Notice that they're delaying castling. No one knows why. Honestly, no one can question these kinds of players about why they do one thing or another. And white plays bishop to d2. The idea behind bishop to d2 is very simple. To develop this bishop so they can connect the rooks. It's the last piece they need to develop. Are they developing it here to attack this point? No, because it's really well defended. Notice that they're developing it here simply because they can't do it here, here, or here. So they have to develop it right here. Queen to c7, they finished developing with the queen, and now they're targeting this pawn, which is the #1 weakness of the white pieces, only defended by this knight. And right now it's attacked by 2 pieces, so white should do something about this point. Since it's very hard to defend, they decide to do something. They choose to directly attack the opponent's knight. Notice what I mentioned to you a moment ago. They're attacking the knight, so we can't capture here. We have to move the knight. Or capture en passant, which is actually what black did. Very logically, they should capture en passant so that this pawn disappears and stops attacking the knight. Here, they recaptured with the knight for a very simple reason. By recapturing with the knight, now they're defending this pawn with both the queen and the knight. In other words, with 2 pieces. This pawn is now fully protected. A tension has been created between these 2 knights, and black is wondering, do I prefer to be captured or to capture myself? Notice if they allow themselves to be captured, these doubled pawns would look really bad here. 2 double pawns, and on top of that, they're isolated because they don't have pawns on their sides. That's why black decided to capture with the knight. Now, let me ask you, dear followers, what would you do here? Would you recapture with the bishop, or would you recapture with the pawn? Well, the correct answer is to recapture with the bishop, because if you recapture with the pawn, that pawn becomes isolated. It doesn't have pawns on its sides, and an isolated pawn is usually a weakness. That's why, by capturing with the bishop, notice how you end up with 2 really good bishops here. And also, these 2 pawns are no longer isolated. Black played this knight job. It looks very interesting. They're attacking this bishop, which doesn't have many squares to go to. Notice that it can't go this way. Here, it would be exchanging bishops, which could be a solution, and going back this way would mean losing the bishop pair, right? Another solution would be to move here. What will white choose here? Well, they go ahead and decide to give up the bishop pair, but by giving up this dark squared bishop. Notice, and if you didn't know, I'll tell you now, that the opponent or the player who has the bishop pair on the board has a slight advantage over their rival. What is that? Because look, the light squared bishop controls the light squares, and the dark squared bishop controls the dark squares. Between the two, you control all the squares on the board. In other words, if you have the bishop pair, you have a slight advantage over your opponent. In this case, after the bishop is recaptured, black now has the bishop pair, while white does not. Now they take advantage of having this open file to attack the opponent's queen. Notice one thing, the black pieces still haven't castled, and that's a disadvantage. Our queen is under attack, so we have to move her. In this case, we find a very juicy square where nothing can attack her. On a dark square. Why is that? Because our opponent doesn't have the dark squared bishop, so she'll be much safer there. What are the white pieces trying to do? Well, a very logical move. Black has the bishop pair, and white doesn't. So with this move, white is basically forcing black to give up the bishop pair, because now this bishop can't move, or they lose the rook. In other words, now black either captures or lets themselves be captured. Here, black castled and allowed this bishop to be taken. For now, the player with the white pieces, Anatoly Karpov, is in no hurry to capture this bishop, since at the moment this bishop is very well placed, aiming at the opponent's castling. And notice that black doesn't have enough pieces to defend, and now it seems like Anatoly is putting on super strong pressure. So, at this point, many of you would probably be shaking. The queen can come in, he can bring in a lot of pieces, and this attack is starting to get dangerous. However, the player with the black pieces didn't flinch. First, Anatoly Karpov attacked the knight. Instead of moving this knight away, Anatoly Karpov went in to give a check with the king, which seems very dangerous, because now this bishop is defended by the knight. But by moving the king, they're attacking this bishop, and if at any point they decide to move the knight away, they would simply lose a piece. However, here, the white pieces don't decide to move the knight away, but instead choose to move the bishop here. And why can't this knight be captured right now? Well, look, because it would simply be check. The king would have to move, and then it would be checkmate. Look at Anatoly Karpov, the tremendous attack he had here. Anatoly Karpov, one of the greatest players in history, had everything planned out. That knight can't be captured. The player with the black pieces is no slouch either, and of course doesn't capture the knight, but instead attacks it with the bishop. He realizes that knight is untouchable. Now, Anatoly Karpov does have to retreat this knight, since it could be captured by the bishop. Where is moving? To the e4 square. Now, on this square, it's super centralized and targeting some very weak squares in black's position. By the way, today I'm recording with a headache I just can't stand, you know? I'm sure a lot of you have noticed it in my voice, but it's unbelievable. So if you give me a nice like, I really will be eternally grateful to you. Here, the black pieces decided to take control of the file. It's very important when there's an open file. What is an open file? A file where there are no pawns, neither your opponent's nor your own, okay? A completely open file. So white had the open file, black didn't, so black decides to also occupy it and fight for the file against the white pieces. A very logical solution. Now, capturing here wouldn't be a very good idea, because after the recapture, it would be black who would be left with the open file all to themselves. That's why the white pieces continue with their plan and place the queen on d3 with a very simple idea. Notice that when this knight disappears, wherever it goes, they're threatening checkmate on this square right here. That's why they set up the queen and bishop in a powerful battery to come and attack with this checkmate here. Now, the black pieces capture this rook. Do you remember what I told you? Now, by capturing this rook, with the recapture of the other rook, it's the white pieces who have control of the file. However, right now, the black pieces don't really care, because after the exchange, what they can do is capture this pawn, and they've won. They're up a pawn. A pawn that sometimes is very important, and sometimes not so much. Let's see in this game if having this extra pawn is really important. Also, now they're making a double attack. By having eliminated a rook, they're attacking the rook and also attacking this pawn here. The white pieces, obviously, if they have to defend one of the two, they defend the rook, and what they do is place it on the same file as the pawn. Yeah. Because if they take this pawn, which is actually what the black pieces do, they're probably going to have trouble moving this knight, right? But notice one thing, black already has two extra pawns. The white pieces try to win back this pawn, and now they're only down one pawn, and they make a brutal double attack, attacking this bishop and this other one. What solution do the black pieces find here to save one of the two bishops? Well, sometimes when two of your pieces are attacked at the same time, you should use one of them to attack a higher value piece, right? Keep this in mind. If two of your pieces are attacked at the same time, you should use one of them to attack a higher value piece. In this case, they use this bishop to attack the rook. Now, it wouldn't be possible to capture this bishop because they would simply capture the rook, which is worth more than the bishop. That's why the white pieces have to move the rook. They move the rook over here. Why? Because now they could join the attack along the third rank. You know that sometimes rooks can come in along the third rank and launch some tremendous attacks. The black pieces, since they have a material advantage, notice that right now they're up a pawn, want to trade queens. When you have a material advantage, the ideal is to try to trade pieces, so you reach an endgame with that advantage. The white pieces, even so, accept this trade because they don't feel at a disadvantage at all. They trade here, recapture with the bishop, and notice that black still has the pair of bishops and an extra pawn. In other words, a pretty interesting advantage, right? They move this knight while attacking the bishop. White is now trying, no matter what, to get rid of that pair of bishops, which is a real headache for the white pieces, right? And here, obviously, they don't capture this knight. Instead, what they do is play this rook. That is, allowing this bishop to be captured. Why? Because if they capture this bishop, this brutal checkmate would simply follow. They could bring the rook back, but after rook takes rook, it would just be checkmate, and this king wouldn't be able to go anywhere. That's why you can't capture this bishop here. Black had everything under control. What they do is bring the knight here, because now they prevent this entry with the knight, and now there really wouldn't be any problem with checkmate. Black launches an attack with the pawns. They play the move g5, a move that might seem strange, but they're expanding with the pawns to be able to bring the king into the attack. You already know that the king is extremely important in the endgame. It looks like the white pieces are just giving away a pawn, doesn't it? However, if you capture this pawn, notice that these two pawns would end up isolated and doubled, which would be too big of a weakness, and both would end up being captured far too easily. That's why, guys, when someone offers a pawn to double pawns like this, don't take here, right? If you fall for it, you'll end up with these two pawns being way too weak. What the black pieces do is ignore the threat and bring the king into the attack. White captures this pawn, black recaptures without any problem, and white plays this bishop, placing it in a much better, more central position, also attacking this pawn. Black doesn't hesitate for a second to push this pawn forward. Notice something super important. Whenever you have a bishop defended by a pawn, it's going to be the most powerful thing you can have in chess. Why is that? Because they can never take this pawn since the bishop defends it, and they can never take this bishop because the pawn defends it. A piece that's weaker than the bishop is just a pawn, and since no pawn can attack it, this setup is going to be tough to break for life. They defend each other. White plays rook to g3 to put pressure on this pawn. Right now they're threatening rook takes pawn sack, and black simply defends it by bringing the king in. Notice that you shouldn't be afraid to bring your king into play in the endgame. It's very important. Notice that this king is much more active than this one. In an endgames, that's extremely important. You'll see it in a moment. White moves the rook, a move that seems pointless. But it's a prophylactic move because black was about to play this and attack the rook. And now this rook can move freely along this file. Where do they play the rook? Well, notice that they're going to have to give it up. Why? Because there's no way to save this rook. Wherever it goes, it's going to end up being captured by the bishop. Right? Pay attention to something super important. Right now, what are the white pieces threatening? I'll explain it to you. Let's suppose white plays the rook over here, okay? The rook over here seems like no one can attack it. Only this bishop could easily attack, but the rook could come back here, and it seems like no one can attack it. Well, this rook would be way out of play, with moves like this one here, where this pawn is attacking. It's true that it could be defended in the same way I mentioned before. They don't defend each other. But you'll see that the white pieces here are no longer coordinating at all. They could simply try to come in with this rook with a deadly attack. If they try to escape with the king this way, then the white pieces could capture this pawn here with the bishop. If they try, for example, to attack this bishop with the rook, then they could simply come in here, check, and once the king moves, they could capture here or come around this way and win this rook in the same manner. Notice that the white pieces aren't coordinating, and that's why it's so important at this moment that the black pieces have, first, the pair of bishops, and second, their pieces coordinated. So what happens? We were in this position. Let me set it up just as it was, like this. In this position, where the rook was here, right? Okay? Where the white pieces have the rook well trapped. What Anatoly Karpov decides to do with the white pieces is to play this king. King to f1 must join the attack. He brings the bishop here, and now tries to bring the king even further into the attack. He changes the direction of the rook. Now he wants to enter through this square here. But anyway, here it still seems like nothing is happening to the white pieces. They try to fight back with this move. They push their pawn into the attack. The black pieces don't hesitate to capture it. The white pieces retake it. With the knight, right now, they're attacking this bishop. The black pieces don't want to give up the bishop pair. Notice they've been fighting the whole game not to give up the bishop pair, and that's probably what's going to give them the win. Right now, the white pieces pull this knight back before it gets captured. Check with the rook. The king doesn't have much choice but to come over here. Then they bring the rook here to attack this square. Notice they're attacking it with two pieces, so now it has to be defended. How do they do it? By moving the pawn. Now, it could be captured. No, because the rook is there. Notice that the knight isn't defending because it's pinned, but the rook is. So what the black pieces do is play this explosive move, which attacks the rook and also this knight. Right now, the black pieces are putting on a lot of pressure. Look at the work the pair of bishops is doing. One attacks on the white squares and the other attacks on the black squares. White has to move this rook. They move it to the only square it can go to while still defending this pawn. And now the black rook comes in to attack this pawn as well. They're running out of defenses. White decides to get the king out of the pin. And now is the moment when black decides to trade their pair of bishops. Why? Because now they know they can take advantage of their lead. They eliminate the defender of this pawn. And when this one is captured, they win this other pawn. And now, check this out. Rook and bishop, rook and bishop. But 3 pawns against 1? And these 2 pawns are just too strong to be stopped. They try to attack. This pawn here. Notice that exchanging rooks here would be really bad news for the white pieces, because they'd be left with 1 bishop each and 2 pawns down. That's why they try to hold on to their only strong piece, the rook. And after defending this pawn, white decided to resign because it's impossible to make any progress. White only has this pawn, which will never be able to advance. And look at this. It's defended by the pawn I told you no one will ever be able to capture. Win 'em. So here, white decided to resign the game. A very interesting opening. If you want me to explain how to play it in more depth, please let me know in the comments, because it's an opening that can bring you a lot of joy. If it can beat one of the best players in history, you can beat your chess.com opponents, right? So it's a very interesting opening. Give me a big like for this headache, which I still went ahead and recorded so you could enjoy it, okay? See ya in the next video, friends. Bye.